Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kirk Almasian. We are live right now on YouTube with Steve Sweeney. He is an RT correspondent, author, and former Morning Star international editor. I'm very happy to have you, Steve, on Syriana Analysis. I'm very interested in both sides of the story. We are already watching a lots of news reports, written or visual, on all social media platforms and on traditional media about NATO's narrative of this war. And I think it's very important to listen what the NATO side is saying, and also compare them with the narrative that is coming from the Russian side, or the sides that are not affiliated with Russia, but they have a different point of view. And one of them is you. You're underground in the Donbas region, and you have been reporting from there. And in the past few weeks, we have seen lots of military developments happening in the Donbas region, and also on the forefronts between the Ukrainian armed forces and the Russian side. Since you're currently in the Donbas, what is the humanitarian situation there, in your opinion? If you can summarize for the people, how is the medical situation, the humanitarian situation, the hospitals, the schools, the general life, of the people there in the region?
Okay, well, the general life for the people in the region is, of course, as you can probably imagine, very difficult. The humanitarian situation is, at times, is pretty bleak. So, for example, there's often difficulties with accessing water. So the water supply is fairly sporadic, and of course, they have to conserve that to ensure, public health and safety is adhered to. But I mean, the main issue I would suggest is not necessarily one of humanitarian aid. There's lots of aid coming through from largely from Russia, from various organisations that are collecting aid. I was at a depot just recently, a few days ago, where an incredible amount of humanitarian aid was stored in a warehouse and was being distributed, but also the local community is also collecting aid as well, and sending supplies and things to the front line, because of course that's really the most critical. Those are the most critical areas at the moment, and particularly those civilian areas that are very close to the front line are in a very difficult situation. Now, I'm not too far from the front line, so I'll talk a little bit about what's going on here as well. But the main issue, I would suggest, is the daily bombing, the daily shelling of civilian areas. Now, this is not something that's happening infrequently. It's not occasionally. And over the last 24 hours, there's been a lot of noise in the sky. It's been pretty much non-stop, this shelling. It's been largely carried out with Western-supplied weapons. I think something like certainly more than 100 shellings were carried out with NATO-supplied, Western-supplied weapons overnight and into the early hours of this morning. And I woke up again. It's pretty much most days you wake up to the sound of an explosion or something. And 25, I think, were from multiple launch rocket systems. So these are the Grad rockets and this kind of thing. Now, we've been fortunate in that most of those have been stopped. They've been repelled by the air defenses, and we have to say that they've done a fantastic job. They do a fantastic job in keeping the civilian populations in Donetsk, in Lugansk, and across the Donbas safe. But of course, that's not always the case. Some of the frontline areas, so there's areas on the outskirts of Donetsk city, for example. Then there's cities adjacent to Donetsk, Makiivka, and of course Gorlovka, which is roughly halfway between Donetsk city and Artemovsk, also known as Bakhmut, of course. And these are the areas that are really taking a serious pounding on a daily basis. And it's got to the stage where every day there's a minimum, there's houses destroyed, there's people that are wounded. In Makiivka just last week there was a hospital partially destroyed. This was one of 9 medical centers that were deliberately targeted in Ukrainian attacks. Every day there's marketplaces. I've attended. I mean, my job is I go and I report on this from the scene of a lot of these incidents, and I find just scenes of utter destruction. and they're people's homes. These are civilian areas, areas where there's no military presence. There are no soldiers. There are no military bases or any other kind of installations. These are just residential streets, small villages, largely populated by babushkas, older women, some older men, children, families, and these are the main victims of of what's happening. So the situation is very difficult, even for the emergency services. So, and you asked a little bit about this. So, just to note that, again, I visited a hospital last a few weeks ago now, after a 12-year-old boy had his leg blown off. I was in his house
Hmm.
about an hour
Wow.
after this attack. A shell tore through the roof of his family's home while he was asleep, and it tore his leg off. There was blood everywhere. The house was completely destroyed. Obviously, his parents and family were completely traumatized by this, as they would be. But I went to visit him in the hospital, and remarkably, he sat up smiling and talking to me, and his words were, sort of touched me really, because he said, "What do you want?" And he just said, "I just want peace. That's all
Wow.
he wants." But he also said that he wanted to stay in Donetsk. He was very clear about that. He said, "This is my home. Why should I leave? This is where my friends are, my family are, my school is, where I grew up." Um, but at 12 years old, he's known very little but war, nothing but
Yeah.
war. But in that hospital, walking around, you can see along the uh, in the corridors, there's wooden boards up where windows used to be.
Yes.
And I went to see the one of the surgeons there, who's the clinical director, I think, of the hospital. And I went into his office, and of course, all of the windows have been blown out. And he explained that actually, while he was at work, this the hospital came under attack, and people were working where they were operating on to save people's lives, and it was shelled by Ukrainian forces. And he described the situation as Donetsk roulette. That's how he
Hmm.
described it. And he said, "You don't know whether you're going to wake up alive, the following morning." And he said a lot of the shelling is indiscriminate. Now, again, the other thing to note with this, and he explained, that a number of health workers have been injured whilst working in the hospital. But also, what happens is, and I've seen this, is when you go to the scene of a shelling, what happens is they'll have one attack, and of course, emergency services arrive on the scene, ambulances, firefighters, to make sure that people are safe, and to save civilians. And then what happens quite often is what they call a double tap. So
Hmm.
it means that as soon as the emergency services arrive on the scene, another strike happens. And I shared a photograph on Facebook, on Twitter yesterday, as we were just driving around the streets of the region, and there was an ambulance in front of us, and it was uh, you know pocked with the fragments um, from a shelling. Uh,
Yes.
and this is the kind of the conditions that they're going into in order to save people's lives. So they're working under extremely difficult conditions. There was a nurse, for example, I think in yeah, that's the picture. That's it. Yeah, you can see the marks there covered. And this is the conditions that they're working in. And not long after I arrived in Donetsk the last time, there was a nurse who was killed on her way to work. She was going to work in the local hospital. What happened was, as she was driving on her route to work, she saw a bus stop, and the bus stop had been shelled, and there were a lot of people wounded. So, being a caring human being, she went to deliver emergency care. And while she was doing that, there was another attack, and she died almost instantly. So,
Steve, what you're saying is it resonates a lot with what happened in Syria, especially in eastern Aleppo, for a very long time. And I remember that people were trying to go, for example, workers, employees going to the airport, they've been kidnapped, nurses were going to the hospitals, the entrance of the hospital was shelled. And the thing is, when people gather to collect the bodies and send them for try to pick them to the hospital, another shell come because they know people will gather there to try to help the injured person, right? And then you see another shell is coming. It reminds me a lot of Syria, but the controversial question here would be, um, In Syria, I'm convinced 100% that the people who live in government held areas are dehumanized. They are less than human for the media and for the establishment that is supporting these so-called rebels in Syria, right? Don't you have the similar feeling that the people in the Donbas region were dehumanized in the past at least 10 to 11 years? No, after 8 years after 2014, since the shelling of the Ukrainian side started on the Donbas region?
Yes, I agree with you 100% on that. And in fact, I was having this very conversation with somebody in the region only yesterday, and we were talking about when, but for the West and for a lot of people in the West, this conflict, the Ukraine conflict, started in February 2014. Sorry, in February 2022. Well, in fact, the reality is it started in April 2014, and soon after the Maidan coup, backed by the United States, backed by the European Union and the West, which ousted a democratically elected government and saw this, an orgy of violence really erupted after that. It gave a huge boost to the far right forces, these forces that now the West were once pillorying and saying that they were a threat to democracy, and now they've suddenly shifted and kind of moved to this position of downplaying their role and saying that even denying their existence in some aspects. But of course, in Donbass, you can't escape the legacy of what they've done to this part of the world. You can't escape that. On a few days ago, for example, I was in Lugansk and I was at a memorial to the people that were killed just in 2014, and I was taken to a field where more than 300 bodies were buried in unnamed graves because
Hmm.
there's efforts to try and identify them. But of course, these people were killed in the very early stages. I think between March and April of 2014, a lot of these people were um, killed right very early on. And actually, sorry, I think it was a bit later than that. I've got my time a little bit muddled there because, but the point is that the shelling was so intense that they were unable to identify the bodies, and they had to be buried because there would have been a public health disaster of some kind, because it was summer, it was intense heat. This was not long after I think the Ukrainian Air Force bombed the people of Lugansk, and they killed a number of civilians, which they initially tried to deny, but on the ground research and video footage showed actually it was definitely
Yeah.
Ukraine that was culpable for this. But there has been this move to dehumanize the people of Donbass, and I was speaking about victims, the worthy victims and victims that are not worthy, and the people in Donbass are not worthy victims. And I think that's people overlook what's happened here. 14,000 people were killed between April 2014 and February 2022. Large number of those were civilians. A huge, a very high number of those were civilians. But they just become a statistic, and this is people's lives. And they
Believe
were,
me, Steve, after some time, they will blame all these deaths on Russia. Like in Syria, for now, they say Assad killed 1 million people. Like
yeah,
they repeat it all the time. You see it on Twitter, on social media, and the mainstream media. They say Assad killed 1 million people.
yeah,
The official statistics of the UN are below first half a million. One third of them are Syrian army soldiers. The one third of them, the rest of the one third are civilians from both sides, and one third are from the fighters. And
yeah,
among the militants, almost half of the deaths were foreign jihadists. So all these details miss, and they do not give you any context, anything. They just throw numbers there. They say 500,000 people died. Assad killed them. And similarly, now in Ukraine, they just show numbers in a discussion without any context, without any sourcing, and then people will repeat it. And this is the original Nazi strategy, in my opinion. Just repeat the lie, create a narrative, and make as much as people believe this narrative. And you have so many people who would believe this. But you mentioned the presence of the far right or the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, which is undeniable. Like, even if the media tries in the first few weeks, maybe 1 month, 2 months, 3 months maximum, you can hide it. But when the war prolongs and the images start coming from different sources, you cannot hide it anymore. Even the mainstream journalists now we are in July 2023, they're not even putting any efforts in hiding these logos and all these badges of the Ukrainian armed forces. At the beginning, they're trying to cherry pick the pictures, sometimes Photoshop them. Now they don't even put any efforts. They just post it the way it is, and you see all
I
this.
think they failed, didn't they? Because I think there were numerous occasions where the NATO press department was putting out photographs of Ukrainian members of the Ukrainian armed forces, and they had Nazi insignia on them. And the Sonnenkrans, I think, was one of them that was that was displayed. And Zelensky, I think he's done a similar thing as well, that posting these kind of things where it's unavoidable, inescapable. So they now try. I think there was an effort where they said, "Well, guys, can you stop wearing these kind of symbols?"
Yeah, the New York Times, was it right? They were asking, they reported that the journalists are asking the soldiers to remove the badge just for the photo shooting.
Incredible. But I mean, I think the important thing that you were talking about, this dehumanization of the people in Donbas, it started again way back in 2014 when there was all this talk about Russian separatists, as though everybody here is they tarred everybody with the same kind of brush, but it was a deliberate choice of words. And then they started, and we've seen it quite a lot now, is that anything to do with Russia or Russian culture, Russian people are demonized, and they're now Putin is the new Hitler, and there's this move to kind of blame everybody in Russia, hold everybody in Russia for what's responsible for happening in Ukraine. And you've seen even the kind of stuff now where the absurdities where Russian composers are now on a blacklisted, and Russian writers. I mean, how can you wipe out people like Dostoevsky and
Yeah, in February 2022, when let's say the hot war started between both sides, I have Russian friends here. Some of them are against the war, some of them are like for their government, but the ones who were against their government or against Putin, they used to tell me this is between Putin and this Ukrainian elements, and I said no, this is about Russia and the proxy war with NATO. And now they can see it with their own eyes, the discrimination that they face in European countries because just they hold a Russian passport, regarding, especially in their job. In their offices, in their job opportunities, in any conference that you have to attend as a musician or as an athlete, etc., etc. And I can see that some of the Russian friends that I had, they started putting Ukrainian flag on their profile photos so that they won't be discriminated against. It's like, it's hilarious, right? But this discrimination is coming also from the far right, and unfortunately 80 years ago today, Ukrainian nationalists began their brutal massacre of the Poles. The followers of Bandera massacred around 60,000 Poles. But today, Bandera is idealized in Ukraine. His grave is here in Munich, in Bavaria, and people go and pay tribute to him. And the other day, at the beginning of June, when the Pride Month started, a Ukrainian singer came in Munich in front of hundreds of people with and they were singing "Bandera is our father," and this is happening here in Germany.
Well, I think that's an important point, actually, because one of the things that is often thrown back at you is this. Well, yes, there are Nazis in Ukraine, but there's Nazis in Russia, and this is what they say. But the very, very big difference is, of course, that in Ukraine they are celebrated officially by the state.
Yes.
They passed legislation making it illegal to criticize Stepan Bandera.
Yes.
Celebrate his birthday. There's these huge torchlit marches on the street, but his birthday, Bandera's birthday, is a public holiday. I mean, this is this is state-sponsored celebration of fascism, of the far right, of Nazis. That's what it is. I mean, this is Bandera is responsible for the death of countless numbers, thousands upon thousands of Jewish people in pogroms were massacred due to Bandera and Bandera's supporters. It's irrefutable. So it was quite hypocritical, I think, to see Zelensky going to pay tribute at the Volyn massacre, the memorial to the Volyn massacre. I think it was, I think this was almost staggering hypocrisy when, on the one hand he's doing that, but then he's doing everything he can to celebrate and promote Bandera. I mean,
The thing is, here in Germany, if you criticize Israeli policy, I'm not talking about Israel as a Jewish state, a policy, a domestic policy, a judicial policy, a discrimination against Palestinians, anything, you are called anti-Semite, right? You lose your job. And there are journalists, they lost their jobs here in the German Deutsche Welle because they found comments of them from 2016 and they are criticizing Israel from 2016. They kicked them out today. But there are Ukrainians singer, like I showed you now on I broadcasted it. He is singing for a Nazi collaborator. He was Hitler's ally. So it's becoming everything is going out of hand, and there is exceptions for everything. So now Nazism is probably good if it is if the Nazis are targeting the Russians. Similarly, Al Qaeda is good when they are targeting Assad and the Syrian government. So this is becoming, in my opinion, a pattern nowadays between the European or the Western policy toward their enemies. It's like using the worst elements, chaotic elements in any society against their enemy, while they despise them in their own societies. And this is really hilarious to see somebody is praising and singing for Bandera here in Germany. But if we move a little bit to another personality who is very interesting, who is Erdogan, right? And and I called his recent maneuverings an acrobatical diplomacy. This guy is very clever. He's just trying to get the maximum from all sides, right? And Erdogan is said to be violated the Azovstal deal. And according to his statements, he signed a drone deal with Ukraine, returned the Azov prisoners of war to Kiev, declared support for Ukraine's NATO membership, and approved Sweden's bid to join NATO. Were you surprised by Erdogan's acrobatic diplomacy? And do you think the Russians they were putting so much hope on Erdogan during the electoral time? Because I think they were betting. Like, I'm not saying that the alternative is good, but they were definitely not betting on the right horse here.
I look. I think it's not a big surprise to me, as somebody that has covered Turkey quite a lot. I've been in prison in Turkey. I was jailed by the Erdogan regime for my criticisms of his government, particularly his links to or his alleged support for ISIS and Al Qaeda, particularly.
No problem.
A situation.
Yeah, he was definitely supporting, in my opinion, Al Qaeda terrorists in Syria up until this moment.
Okay, pause things a sec. I think we've got.
No problem. So, guys, we were speaking about Erdogan, and I do believe that Erdogan, up until this moment, he's a very good, actually, chess player. He is, I always say, he's clever, and he has clever advisors. On the Washington and Brussels and now Moscow, he's playing on both sides or three sides, and he's trying to gain the maximum from all sides. And there is nothing wrong about that. But during the election times, I know that the NATO side, they preferred Kılıçdaroğlu over Erdogan, because Erdogan is a tough negotiator, and he is ready to willing to compromise and give what NATO wants, but for a big price. And I think that's it's his national interest, right? But the amount of support that he received from the Russian side, the Russian media, the Russian activists, and at the same time the Iranian side, it was hilarious. All of a sudden, I had the feeling that Erdogan has become an anti-NATO symbol or an anti-NATO character who is going to crush the U.S. hegemony and the U.S. imperialism, etc., etc. Erdogan is the leader of a country that is an essential part of NATO. And he's just making the job of NATO difficult, but he is still following the main guidelines of NATO. There are certain differences between NATO and the Turkish side. For example, when it comes to Syria, the American side is more in support of the Kurdish militias, and Erdogan is, of course, considers the Kurdish militias terrorist organizations, and he's supporting Al Qaeda terrorists. So both sides still like when it comes to serious negotiations, they give Erdogan a piece of cake and they tell him, yeah, you can create this northern belt in Syria, you can keep your forces in Idlib, but you have to let us to have more presence in the eastern side of Syria. You have to let us support the Kurdish militias there. So Erdogan, all in all, he's a very good chess player, in my opinion, and he has been playing this double game for a long time. But now it has become, when it comes to the proxy war with Ukraine, I think it was a little bit ridiculous to consider him an anti-NATO figure during the elections, like he's going to change the balance of power in the world. And now you can see that Erdogan is willing to compromise with NATO. Steve, I was talking about that Erdogan is a very good chess player. He's willing to compromise with NATO for the good price. Like he's a good negotiator.
Sorry, I'm very sorry, but I'm going to have to go. We've got a breaking situation.
No problem, Steve.
Listen, I'll contact you as soon as I'm back.
Yeah. Go. We are. I will continue the live stream a little bit with our audience, guys. Steve is a correspondent there, so he has to go and cover some breaking news now in the Donbas. Steve, thank you very much for being with us. Don't worry. Go.
Sorry to have to leave right now.
No problem. No problem. Go. We'll see you later. So, guys, Steve had to go because he's in the war zone, and he had like a few times, sometime to join me from eastern Ukraine or from the Donbas region, recently captured by the Russian Federation. So I was asking him about Erdogan. This is my honest opinion about Erdogan. I think he's a very good politician for his country. And you know that this coming from Syrian of an Armenian origin. I mean, he's a tough player in the region. But I found it very ridiculous from the Iranian and the Russian side to really try to present him as an anti-imperialist figure. He is not, and he just wants the best for his country, and he is willing to get some of the eggs from the Russian side and some of the eggs from the NATO side. My criticism was more about the political and diplomatic coverage of Erdogan's character. Now, Erdogan says the EU needs to open the door for Ankara's membership to the European Union. In return, Turkey may open the door for Sweden's NATO bid. So the problem with this demand is we all know that the European Union is not going to allow Erdogan to join NATO. To join the European Union. European Union has closed its door a long time ago, and I will be very honest with you. They are not going to allow a country to join a union where the Erdogan side, or there is a strong force in Turkey, especially represented by the Muslim Brotherhood. They're going to blackmail the European Union all the time with refugees, for example. They're going to weaponize the refugees, and they're going to say, oh, we're going to open the borders with the European. If the borders are open between Turkey and the European Union, you have 3.5 million Syrian refugees who are going to come in. You can't believe me on this. In 3 days, 3.5 million refugees from Turkey, they're going to come to Europe. They're not gonna stay in Turkey at all. So this is impossible. Secondly, the demographic aspect is very important for Europe as well. We're talking about 3.5 million Muslims. From the perspective of the European side, they consider this a demographic change and demographic threat, probably on their societies. And this could also increase the popularity of the far right groups. And if such thing happens, rest assured that most people will vote for far right groups, and this will change the entire geopolitics of the European Union. Forget about the Meloni case, but the FPÖ, for example, in Austria, the AfD in Germany, and Marine Le Pen in France, those are hardcore, in my opinion, politicians who would, or political parties who would not hesitate to challenge the NATO hegemony over Europe and pushing the entire continent against the Russian Federation. I believe that if Turkey joins the European Union, this is the outcome, the political outcome. And this is just my prediction since I live here and I'm interacting with the people. Now, we had another clownish event recently. We have seen that the NAFO trolls gathered somewhere in Europe and they presented themselves. I was the other day walking here also in Berlin, and I crossed the NAFO meeting. People are gathering here, and you can see from these people, they're mostly armchair activists, in my opinion, who do not have serious things to do in life. They just dedicate their time day and night on Twitter, trolling people, posting memes, and trying to bash arguments, not with arguments, but with just ridiculing them. This is the strategy of NAFO. Someone like me goes and reads some books, and I come and present to you the headlines of this book and try to explain to you what's happening geopolitically, and some theories, and not somebody, hundreds of them, they come to your Twitter account and like this is the strategy, in my opinion, just to ridicule the people. And it's not in my opinion an efficient strategy, because there are so many people who can shape the public opinion from both sides, and they're very intellectual people. And healthy discussion on social media platforms, in my opinion, is very, very important for serious people to make up their minds. Finally, I want to just say I want to touch on the issue of the BBC. The BBC is now banned in Syria. Damascus government withdrew the accreditation of the BBC. I will just mention a few things about this. One, the BBC was present in Syria before the war and after the war. As when the war erupted in 2011, the BBC remained in Syria, the accreditation remained, and they covered the war for 12 years. They had good correspondent in Arabic in Syria, but also the English part. They were coming all the time, every few months. They're getting journalistic visa, not only the BBC, Channel 4, CNN, so many mainstream journalists. They came and they even interviewed Assad. They asked him hard questions. They tried to trap him. They did everything. But we know, like I know, and you know, and everybody knows, that the BBC is on the side of the terrorists in Syria, and they're not impartial. They're not neutral. They're not objective, and all these things. It's just a BS. You know that. They wish that Assad would gone. They wish that the alternative, whoever it is, from the Muslim Brotherhood, from a cocktail of Islamist terrorists, would come and occupy Damascus, and they would rule it. They don't mind. At the end of the day, the MI6 and the British and Great Britain, they're the ones who created the Muslim Brotherhood in the early 20s in the 20th century, in order to fight against the socialists and against the nationalists who were organizing protests and organizing armed resistance against the British and the French colonizers in the Middle East. That's why they created the Islamists. They supported them so that the Islamists would fight against the left wing. Back then, they were anti-imperialists, right? And also against the nationalists who were fighting against the colonizer. This was the reason. So I don't think the British side would be sad if the Muslim Brotherhood rules Syria. Secondly, during the war, we know what's their purpose, right? but the war, the let's say the acts of hostilities, the hot war is 70% is over in different sides of Syria. And now we have a diplomatic warfare, and also we have an economic warfare. And what the BBC has done recently, they are trying to help the governments in London and Washington to continue the sanctions regime against the Syrian people, and specifically from the gate of what they call the drug production scene in Syria. So I want to say something. The Syria before the war, it was very safe place. There were no drugs and all this stuff, right? But during the war, the borders were loose. The Syrian government lost the borders, almost most of them. The borders were open from all sides, and you had complete destruction of the Syrian economy. So there were mafias were created even from the government side. They are for pro-government. They're working in the government side, but they're mafias. For example, you have the electricity mafia in Syria. And these people, they steal the fuel from some places and they generate electricity in exchange for money. You have the mafias who are producing drugs, something called the um, I forgot the name of the Keptagon. It's called. I think in the 70s and the 60s, this drug was used for depression, and it's now used as a drug. People use it as a fun or something. I don't know. So this Keptagon thing is being produced in Syria with tons of them, and they're being exported to Jordan, to Saudi Arabia, to Gulf countries. And recently, Saudi Arabia, when they restored ties with Syria, they said that we have to fight this phenomena. And in collaboration with Jordan, the UAE, Egypt, and Syria. And the Syrian side accepted. And accordingly, the Jordanian side started bombing and shelling inside Syrian territories on places that the Jordanian intelligence believes that there are production of Keptagon. So what the BBC has done, they of course interviewed the terrorists, the sympathizers of the terrorists, and they took all the testimonies from the people who are pro the terrorists, and they formed a narrative that the family of Assad are behind the business of the Keptagon, which was completely refuted by the Syrian government. But they were, it seems that they were really pissed off by this, that there is no hope from the BBC, and these people, they wish that through such reportages and so-called investigations, and we know that the BBC was wrong on so many occasions on Syria, and they published false information and false reporting on Syria on so many occasions, intentionally and on purpose. So on this, after this reportage, the Syrian government believes that the BBC is just trying to prolong the sanctions regime by London, the EU, and the United States against Syria. Therefore, there is no need for the BBC in Syria. And I've seen so many now comments from even British people saying that like they're celebrating it, and they are saying kudos to Syria. Syria has big balls compared to other countries, etc., etc. Personally, I would be very honest with you. I am against censoring any media outlets, but there are also some reportings that are really negates the reality on the ground, and it creates a situation where millions of people are suffering. So also there is a responsibility from the media side to report the truth about what's happening in Syria and help the Syrian people. The mission of the media is to be on the side of the people, not against them. You can be against the regime as much as you want, but when this so-called regime is the one who is importing all the basic necessities for the people, and you are just prolonging the draconian sanctions on the regime and eventually on the Syrian people, then millions of people are starving. The $1 before the war on Syria was 46 Syrian lira. 46 Syrian lira, $1. Today is around 10,000 Syrian lira. Syria doesn't have cash anymore. Syria cannot uh, do not have any dollars or euros in its central bank anymore, and it's just printing money to pay for the employees, and it's just creating inflation. So we have to lift the sanctions. We have to allow Syria to recover so that it can do business with the neighboring countries, and that so we can have money in the central bank so that the value of the Syrian lira uh, could be empowered, right? Strengthened again. But this is what they're not allowing for Syria to do. So this is the real problem, in my opinion, with the media and with the politics that is working day and night against Syria. And so many people will come say, no, this is against the Assad regime. But you know that the Assad regime is not affected by it, right? They are the people, especially after the earthquake. And now nobody's talking about the what happened after the earthquake. Have the people uh, gone to their homes again? Have their apartments been reconstructed again? No, but people forgot about it because there is not much talk about it. So where is the media from this? Where is the BBC from shedding light on these cases? They don't care about the Syrian people. They don't care. So this is the real problem, in my opinion. I will just check the comments, guys, in the live chat. Um, Oh, unfortunately, Steve had to leave, as I mentioned. Who is the Islamist? Peter says. So I will define you who the Islamist is. You have a person who is a Muslim, right? And this Muslim person is following his holy book. He is following the rules of the book, the Quran, and he is praying to God and believing in his religion. This is the Muslim, and he is just practicing his religion for his individuality and also with his family. But the Islamist is the one who wants to impose his beliefs, just like these radical left wingers nowadays and so called neoliberals, who would like to impose their ideology and their way of life on the rest of the people. And if you don't follow their uh, values, so called values, or the ideology, then you're a bad person, and they fight against you. They make you lose your job. They tarnish your reputation. The Islamists are more radical, in my opinion. They use guns and they use knives. Some of these people in this so-called radical left scene, they also are shooting in the schools. We have seen them in so many occasions. They're dangerous people, in my opinion. So yeah, neoliberals are not leftists. They call themselves leftists. They are not. I know, Odin. But there is this radical scene in the United States which has, it is reflecting on the rest of the world. Then they are trying to impose this ideology on the rest of the world. Like, look, I am, for example, against so much against the Qatari foreign policy, and I think no one criticized the Qatari foreign policy and their support for the terrorist groups in the region more than me. And Al Jazeera tarnished my tried to tarnish my reputation so many times. They called me all sorts of names, and yeah. But when there was this World Cup, right? Why would the Western side impose what they think is right on Qatar? This is so hypocritical. Who says that these values are the correct ones? Who says that even if it's the correct one, it may be correct for everyone? Why do they think everyone is the same? Why do they think that all cultures are the same? History is relevant, and civilizations are relevant. You have to see everyone, every country's history, civilization, culture, religion, society, so many things. But these people completely ignore that. Uh, what about the economic implications in the event of Turkey EU membership? That's a very good question, actually. I think before we speak about that, I truly believe Turkey will never ever join the European Union. And with the current situation in Turkey and with the economic problems that they're facing, the only incentive that the European side could um, accept is if Turkey converts itself into an energy hub, because the European Union are in dire need of gas now, and after the blast of the Nord Stream pipelines. And if Turkey promises or agrees with the European side to deliver gas to European Union, of course through Russia, but indirectly, like they're doing now through India, through China, and elsewhere, that would be a good incentive. But at the same time, the European Union would also argue that even if Turkey doesn't join EU, they can strike similar deal with the Turkish side without Turkey joining the European Union. So I think Turkey doesn't have any chance. But why don't you shave your beard, Kevork? Are you my mother commenting this in a secret profile? And I think the name is in Japanese or in Chinese. I don't know. So I didn't have a beard before I came to Germany anyways, but I like it a lot. Yeah, I think this is all for today, guys. I will try to cover the BBC's closure in Syria, hopefully tomorrow. And probably I would host Vanessa Billy, since she's in Syria and she's a British journalist there. Let's discuss about that tomorrow, okay? For now, I've been your host, Kirk Almasian of Syriana Analysis. If you're new, please subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video with your friends. And also, if you want to support my independent work, you can become a patron. Link in the description below.